Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My name is Rupal Mehta, and I am a senior fellow at the center, and I'll be moderating the lecture today entitled, How New is the New Nuclear Age? It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker today and my dear friend, Dr. Mark Bell. Mark Bell is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. His research examines issues relating to nuclear weapons and proliferation, international relations theory, and US and British foreign policy. His first book, Nuclear Reactions: How Nuclear Armed States Behave, examines how states change their foreign policies when they acquire nuclear weapons. It was published in 2021 by Cornell University Press and won the International Studies Association Foreign Policy Analysis Section's Best Book Award. His other work has been published in journals including International Organization, International Security, International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of Strategic Studies, and the Texas National Security Review. And some of his policy-oriented work has also been published in Foreign Affairs, War on the Rocks, and the Washington Quarterly. His work has also been funded by organizations including the Stanton Foundation, the U.S. Air Force Academy, and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. In today's talk, Dr. Bell explores the dynamics of the new nuclear age. Since the mid-2010s, scholars and analysts have declared the emergence of a dangerous new or third nuclear age. Beyond academia, the concept of the new nuclear age is proving influential with policymakers in a range of countries. The new nuclear age is understood to be characterized by technological change, nuclear multipolarity, eroding constraints on the behavior and competition of nuclear armed states, and the likely emergence of new nuclear powers. That said, it does remain unclear how we should understand the new nuclear age in broader terms. How new is it, and does it require the sort of new theoretical frameworks to understand? In this project, Dr. Bell subjects the concept of the new nuclear age to scrutiny and connects discussions of the new nuclear age to ongoing but mostly separate debates about nuclear history and the, quote, theory of the nuclear revolution, or TNR. The increasing body of literature challenging TNR reveals a more competitive, complex, and dangerous nuclear past than our prior misunderstandings. But in doing so, it actually draws attention to continuities between the past and the emerging nuclear age. He then examines the empirical features thought to define the nuclear age and shows that many of the historical precedents do not require novel theoretical frameworks to understand. This new nuclear age may therefore actually be somewhat less new and perhaps no more dangerous than it actually appears. This talk will follow the format of other CGSR lectures. Dr. Bell will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. During his talk, please feel free to get your questions ready, and you can start raising your hands electronically or by typing questions into the chat while he is speaking. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today, and over to you.
Great. So let me just try to share my screen. So thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about this project, which is very much a work in progress. And so really looking forward to conversation, criticisms, suggestions, and things that, you know, have a conversation about parts of this argument that are kind of stronger or weaker. As Rupal said, you know, the topic here is hopefully fairly self-explanatory from the title, right? I think in this sort of project emerged from what essentially had become, over the course of the 2010s, kind of a real conventional wisdom, a kind of consensus that we were entering or had already entered into a kind of fundamentally new and dangerous nuclear era. So you saw over this period a whole bunch of publications in both academic journals, but also more sort of policy-oriented journals, books, pieces in foreign affairs, edited volumes, and so on, all of which basically made the argument that a whole bunch of things had changed, right? Such that the new nuclear era was new, but also fundamentally different to the kind of nuclear ages that had preceded it. And I guess to me, and I should say, right, and that, you know, this wasn't just a conversation among academics, right? This was also a concept that really kind of seeped into policy discourse, right? In not just in the United States, but across a bunch of countries, right? So this is the UK Chief of Defence Staff saying, you know, a third nuclear age is upon us. This is the Australian Deputy Defence Minister talking also about a new age, but referring to the nuclear dynamics of that age. And Vipin Narang, the US Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense, friend of Rupal and mine, also saying, you know, we find ourselves in a new nuclear age. So this has really become this kind of conventional wisdom, this consensus across both the kind of academic community looking at nuclear issues and the policy world. And so I wanted to kind of subject this to scrutiny because I think it has actually been kind of taken for granted, right? It hasn't been examined in sufficient detail exactly what is new about the new nuclear age and how much of it is new. And if it is new, and to the extent it's new, does it in fact require new kind of conceptual tools to understand it, right? Or even if it's somewhat new, can we actually still understand it with some of the same tools and concepts that we understood prior nuclear ages? So that's what this project aims to do, is basically to subject this concept of the new nuclear age to scrutiny and see how new it really is. So that's what I'll be doing in this talk. I'm going to start by kind of laying out the way that advocates of the new nuclear age think about it, right? What are the features of the new nuclear age that they think are new? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them in turn, right? And kind of try to talk through how new each of them are. And, you know, to give you my bottom line up front, all right, I actually don't think there's a ton that is entirely new here. I think there are sort of certain things that are new challenges for US policymakers, but are not really features of a new nuclear age kind of writ large. I think there are some slightly new twists, but I think actually a lot of what we're seeing in the new nuclear era actually has strong historical precedents, right? And we actually have the tools, the concepts to understand them and to kind of address and deal with the risks that they pose. So that's kind of where I'm headed. Okay, so as I said, right, there's this consensus that the new nuclear age is both new and dangerous, right? It needs new policies, new tools, new theories to understand it. Is it? Right, so how new are the features which define the new nuclear era, and does it require new theories to understand? And I think this is really important because, you know, as I said, this idea has become central to policy debates, but it's not a kind of politically neutral concept, right? It is used as the basis for making particular policy recommendations, right? So if the concept is problematic, right, but it's proving incredibly influential, right, that's potentially problematic in terms of the implications that has for the policy recommendations that are being based on the concept. You know, I think this is also, you know, within the academic world, you know, historians, but folks in other social science disciplines as well, often recognize the kind of very arbitrary and sometimes misleading nature of what they call periodization, right? Which is essentially what we're doing here. We're like taking the nuclear era, splitting it up into kind of different periods, right? And in the same way that that's often arbitrary if we talk about, you know, the change from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, right? I think historians are often very cautious about the sort of material basis for those kind of periodizations. And so I think it's appropriate to subject this concept to a little more scrutiny than it has been subjected to so far. Especially since, at least, you know, within the academic world, there's a major kind of reevaluation of nuclear history that is ongoing, right? Both historians, political scientists, others, right, that is kind of exposing a much more competitive nuclear past. And I think that also, I'm going to argue, suggests that actually there's quite a lot of continuities between the nuclear past and the sort of allegedly more competitive new nuclear era. And as I said, right, my argument here is not much is really new, with a few possible exceptions. So the new nuclear age is I think, a little less new. That doesn't mean it's less dangerous necessarily than it appears. Okay, so how do advocates of the third nuclear age, people who are proposing the existence of the third nuclear age, how do they understand what preceded it, right? And generally, how they understand what preceded it is in two sort of prior nuclear ages. So the new nuclear age then becomes the third nuclear age. So the first nuclear age is generally understood to be essentially the Cold War, right? This is a period of bipolar competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that dominates the kind of nuclear landscape. You ultimately get to a situation of mutual assured destruction, some amount of strategic stability between the two superpowers. And so while the kind of risk of superpower war is always kind of hanging over the international system, there's a certain amount of stability to the system. And ultimately, obviously, there is not a sort of all-out superpower war. And indeed, despite the competition, there is actually a certain amount of cooperation between the superpowers on certain things relating to the nuclear landscape, right? Arms control, non-proliferation, and so on. Okay, so then the second nuclear age comes at the end of the Cold War, right? So we're in the unipolar world. The United States is by far the most powerful country. The Soviet Union has collapsed, right? So by definition now, there's only one superpower. There's no risk of superpower war. There's no nuclear competition of the sort seen in the Cold War, the kind of arms racing that characterized the Cold War. And so the set of nuclear concerns that people are concerned by in this era are very different, right? Concerns about proliferation in South Asia and the consequence of India and Pakistan acquiring nuclear weapons within that region. Fears of kind of rogue states acquiring nuclear weapons, Iran, North Korea, and so on. Particularly after 9/11, obviously a big focus of concern on nuclear terrorism and the focus on securing loose nuclear materials as a way of reducing the risk of that happening, right? So those are kind of the sort of standard portrayal of the first nuclear age and the second nuclear age. In contrast, right, the third nuclear age is understood to be characterized by a different set of kind of features, right? So while different authors kind of emphasize different things, there is a general consensus about some key differences between the first and the second nuclear ages and the new third nuclear age. First, there's a general sense that there's a whole bunch of technological changes occurring that are increasing the vulnerability of nuclear arsenals, right? It's threatening states' second strike capabilities. So what are these? Well, there's this talk of a kind of new era of counterforce that's mainly driven by improvements in accuracy and remote sensing that make it far easier to potentially target states' nuclear capabilities, including capabilities that we might previously have thought were relatively secure or hard to target, mobile assets, submarines, and so on. Moreover, there's sort of increasing options to do some of those operations, conduct some of those counterforce operations using conventional military capabilities, right? So improved precision strike, improved accuracy, all make conventional counterforce more plausible. Obviously, that's combined with cyber capabilities that might be able to conduct left of launch operations, stop missiles from being launched. And all of this is, of course, potentially enhanced by artificial intelligence capabilities and the capacity to analyze and take in huge amounts of data that offers. So that's one big kind of cluster of things that are understood to characterize the new nuclear era. Second, so in contrast to the kind of bipolarity of the first nuclear era and the unipolarity of the second nuclear era, there's a sense that the third nuclear era, the new nuclear age, is characterized by multipolarity. Now, as I'll talk about, people understand this in very different ways when you actually kind of dig into it, but it has to do with the rise of China, China's nuclear expansion, the kind of interlinked dynamics that can result in a world of multiple nuclear powers. So, for example, China makes adjustments to its nuclear posture in response to the United States. That has implications for what India needs to possess. What India does in response then has implications for what Pakistan does, right? So you get these kind of interlinked dynamics that are pointed to by a number of authors as sort of characteristic of the emerging new nuclear age. Third, there's a sense that the behavior and competition of nuclear armed states is increasingly unconstrained, right? Or competitive, right? You've seen obviously the abandonment of a whole bunch of arms control deals. Arguably, there's sort of this weakening nuclear taboo. A lot of authors point to greater comfort by a range of states in making nuclear threats. And it's argued that we see a whole bunch of nuclear-enabled aggression in the new nuclear era, right? Russia's invasion of Ukraine, obviously a kind of example of that, fears about what China might do with respect to Taiwan, and so on. And fourth, authors point to likely proliferation in the new nuclear era, right? Potentially by both US allies and adversaries, right? Obviously, among allies, there's kind of a lot of conversations about concerns about the reliability of US extended nuclear deterrence. Among adversaries, right? Perennial proliferation concerns with respect to Iran and other countries. So the bottom line here is that there's a whole bunch of features that authors point to say there's something new happening here, right? The new nuclear era is less stable than the past. It's more dangerous than the past. And we need particular policies to address that. And so you see language like, right, this is a Category 5 hurricane. This is deeply challenging. We're entering an era of nuclear anarchy and so on, right? So authors proposing this are making a pretty strong set of claims here, right? There's a whole bunch that is different, and those things are making the nuclear landscape particularly dangerous. Okay, so I'm now going to just basically sort of go through each of them and kind of talk a little bit about each of them. Obviously, there's a lot more in the paper, sort of going into a lot of detail. I'm happy to talk in more detail about any of them in the Q&A, but just to sort of lay out what my argument is with respect to each of these kind of components of the new nuclear era. Okay, so technology and the vulnerability of nuclear arsenals. I think it's undeniably true that a whole bunch of technologies do indeed threaten the survivability of nuclear arsenals today. But the question of how new that is, I think, is debatable, right? I think, actually, when you look at the sort of emerging rewriting of nuclear history, it is actually very clear that the desire by states to threaten other states' nuclear arsenals, and a certain degree of success in doing so, is actually not at all novel, right? This is actually a driving feature of nuclear history, is the desire by states to have counterforce options and some degree of success in achieving those options. So the sort of stability of the first nuclear age that advocates of the new nuclear age sort of point to, I think is actually largely mythical. The Cold War was never as stable as we now sometimes like to think it was. And part of the reason it wasn't stable was actually this drive for the desire to threaten states' nuclear arsenals on both the Soviet and the US side. Right. So our standard history of the Cold War, right, that emphasizes that sort of strategic stability is actually quite misleading, I think. In fact, it's the desire to escape mutual assured destruction precisely through counterforce and damage limitation that actually drove many of the key dynamics of the Cold War. And indeed, it was the success of those efforts, right, that were actually central to a whole bunch of the dynamics of the Cold War, right? US extended deterrence in Europe, for example, is basically made credible in the US, sort of in US eyes, by having credible counterforce, credible damage limitation options. So I think, it's just not really, it doesn't seem to me to be a major discontinuity with the past to say there's a whole bunch of interest and potential success in achieving counterforce capabilities, right? This is actually part of a much longer running story of the entire nuclear era. Conventional counterforce too, right? I mean, some advocates of the third nuclear age sort of point to the increasing feasibility of conventional counterforce, but I think this too actually has a long history, right? The Reagan era maritime strategy was precisely a conventional counterforce strategy. I think it is true that in the past, the states that were able to threaten conventional counterforce were ones that also had nuclear weapons, right? Today, I think it is true that there are potentially things that non-nuclear armed states now have the capability to do that might threaten nuclear armed states' arsenals. So that, I think, is somewhat novel. But beyond that, I think, conventional counterforce also has a long history. Moreover, I think we haven't yet reached a kind of new equilibrium, right, in terms of where this kind of back and forth between defenders and attackers will land, right? So yes, there's a whole bunch of technologies today that might plausibly threaten nuclear arsenals, but defenders also have agency in responding to those technologies. And indeed, some of those technologies may actually prove quite helpful in defending the security of your and reliability of your nuclear arsenals. So it's not clear that the ultimate equilibrium we will end up in is going to be fundamentally different in terms of the vulnerability of nuclear arsenals, right? I think, and therefore I think this is not yet, or to me at least, has not yet convincingly demonstrated as a sort of fundamentally new feature of the new nuclear age. Okay. Nuclear multipolarity. So this, I think, gets very slippery very quickly because different people in this debate define or understand nuclear multipolarity in very different ways. And so I'm just going to sort of run through a few different definitions that get used, often not explicitly, but are kind of implicit in what's argued. And sort of talk through whether and to what extent they are, in fact, new features of anything. So one is that, a lot of people refer to, so this is in Narang and Vadi's Foreign Affairs piece, Jenny Naylor's piece, that basically what's new here is that the United States is now facing two nuclear peers, right? In the past, the United States faced Soviet Union, now Russia, right? It's the only other state with a similarly large and diverse nuclear arsenal. Now China is another kind of nuclear peer. I mean, it's certainly the case that the sort of trajectory of China's nuclear expansion is very significant, right? Suggests a desire by China to acquire an arsenal that looks more like the United States or the Soviet Union in comparison to the very limited nuclear arsenal it's previously had. But China's arsenal remains much smaller than the United States and Russia's, right, for the time being. So at most, I think this is a potentially novel challenge for US policymakers, right? But it's not a feature of the nuclear age writ large, I don't think, right? Other states have dealt with multiple nuclear armed peers before, right? China has 4 nuclear armed states on its border, right? So, this is, I think, potentially certainly a challenge for US policymakers. It's certainly correct for US policymakers to be thinking about the implications of China's nuclear expansion. But I don't think this is a feature of a sort of new nuclear age sort of across the, at the global level. Another way this gets understood is that it's sometimes argued that, well, the overall distribution of power is now multipolar, and the poles are nuclear armed. So whereas in the past you had a bipolar distribution of power in which the poles were nuclear armed, and then you had a unipolar distribution of power. The argument is now you have a multipolar distribution of power. The problem, I think, with this argument, and this is made by Futter and Zala in a very good series of pieces. The problem here is that I think, most scholars at least think the system remains unipolar, or at best kind of weakly bipolar under standard metrics of power, right? And the key here is that it's just not clear who the third pole would be after the United States and China, right? By standard metrics of power, right? Russia's economy, population, very small. India's population, India's far poorer on a per capita basis, has a lot less of the kind of power projection capabilities. So it's really not clear why we should think the world currently is multipolar rather than some weaker version of unipolarity, or a sort of unbalanced bipolarity with the United States and China. I think clearly the balance of power is shifting, right? The US is less dominant than it once was at the height of unipolarity. But to argue that we're suddenly in this kind of multipolar era, I think it's not clear that there's kind of evidence to support that. So I think the balance of power is shifting, but the world is not multipolar yet. Third, and Caitlin Talmadge, Ruth Crilly make this kind of argument that what's kind of new in the new nuclear era is that there are multiple distinct nuclear competitions and rivalries. Here, I'm just not convinced. I mean, I think this was a feature of the Cold War. It's certainly a feature of the post-Cold War when you have India, Pakistan added to the sort of US-Soviet, Soviet-Chinese, US-Chinese nuclear competition. So to me, it seems like actually multiple distinct nuclear competitions are actually kind of a pretty prominent feature of nuclear history and do not mark a significant discontinuity with the present. Okay, so that's nuclear multipolarity. Third, it's argued that there are kind of unique a sort of lack of constraints on the competition and behavior of nuclear armed states. So what people point to here is kind of the use of nuclear threats, the degree of nuclear-enabled aggression, the weakening of the nuclear taboo, the collapse of arms control. All of these are kind of taken as evidence that the gloves are off essentially in terms of the new nuclear era, and therefore the degree and danger and competition associated with the new nuclear era is far higher than the past. I think this kind of massively romanticizes the Cold War. I think nothing in the new nuclear era yet approaches the ferocity of the Cold War competition. And I think we shouldn't forget, right, or we need to maybe remember how ferocious that competition was, right? You're talking about a massive nuclear arms race in which these states are building tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, right? Conducting hundreds of nuclear tests, right? Engaging in regular nuclear crises that had, significant risk of nuclear escalation, right? And I just don't think anything in the current nuclear era yet compares to that, right? Maybe we'll get there, but right, I think it's not something that we see yet in the any of the kind of adversarial relationships that are characterizing the new nuclear era. Moreover, I think nuclear-enabled aggression, nuclear-enabled revisionism, as well as fears of nuclear-enabled aggression and nuclear-enabled revisionism, are actually long-standing features of the behavior of nuclear-armed states, right? This was sort of the subject of my first book, right? But if you think back across nuclear history, you actually have a lot of cases of countries acquiring nuclear weapons and then setting out to change various aspects of their surroundings, right? I mean, one way to understand, right, the entirety of US post-World War II grand strategy is as a large exercise, essentially, in nuclear-enabled revisionism, right? The United States gets nuclear weapons and then uses those after it uses them on Japan, uses those nuclear weapons to backstop a completely unprecedented and sort of globe-spanning network of alliances, right, that allows the United States to essentially build this new world order in the aftermath of World War II, right? That I think is nuclear-enabled revisionism, right? I mean, it's using its nuclear weapons as the basis for a fundamental shift in its grand strategy that it had never considered prior to World War II. With respect to arms control, I think this is also an area where you're seeing a significant rethinking of how we understand the history of arms control. And this is a sort of effort that is occurring in both history and in political science, work by people like John Maurer, James Cameron, Brendan Green, Sarah Biggood, and others. Right, all of which kind of pointing to ways in which arms control, we should actually understand arms control as kind of a vehicle for nuclear competition rather than a constraint upon it, right? And when you think about arms control and you start to sort of view arms control in that way, right, suddenly the absence of arms control is not necessarily an indication that suddenly we're in a fundamentally more competitive nuclear arena. In fact, arms control was precisely the sort of way in which nuclear competition was conducted for large parts of the Cold War. And on the nuclear taboo, I go into a sort of more detail on this in the paper, but just to summarize, I think it's very unclear that the nuclear taboo is weakening. I think a lot of the evidence you would want to make that claim we just don't have access to. And there's a lot of questions and debate, I think, about how strong it ever was. Right? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the nuclear taboo, but it's not clear that we can definitively say that the nuclear taboo is fundamentally weaker than it was in the past. So overall, therefore, I think it's kind of ahistoric to view today's nuclear competition as fundamentally unprecedented. I think we shouldn't forget how kind of ferocious and dangerous the nuclear past was with respect to that. Okay, then proliferation. So I think there are certainly strong arguments for thinking that proliferation may occur in the new nuclear era. I think there are a whole bunch of constraints on proliferation that may be weakening. There are certainly countries that you can plausibly tell a story about why they might want nuclear weapons, given the particular security challenges they face. Right? But that said, there has been no proliferation in the new nuclear age thus far, right? The last new nuclear state was North Korea in 2006, so we've gone 20 years now without any country acquiring nuclear weapons. No countries acquiring nuclear weapons since the sort of 2010, the kind of early 2010s, which is when people started talking about the existence of a new nuclear age. So at least as things stand, like if the new nuclear age is distinctive, it's actually distinctive at the moment for the absence of proliferation more than the threat of proliferation. So, to the extent that this argument is persuasive, I think it's entirely forward-looking and sort of speculative. It's about what might happen in the future. But we should note that analysts and scholars as well, have consistently over-predicted proliferation in the past. So it's perfectly possible that we're sort of making a mistake that actually we've made plenty of times in the past in terms of anticipating proliferation that ultimately did not occur. And many of the ongoing dynamics that we see with respect to proliferation, whether that's kind of preventive war with Iran, whether it's doubts about US extended nuclear deterrence, right? These are all things we've seen before in prior episodes of proliferation or prior episodes where there were concerns about proliferation. So, again, it's not totally clear that we need kind of fundamentally new tools to be able to understand what's happening at the moment. Okay, so just to wrap up, and then I look forward to questions and comments. So overall, I think, there's actually reason to think that the new nuclear age is fundamentally less new than it appears. All right. Now, that doesn't mean the new nuclear age is not dangerous, right? But my view is that those dangers are actually continuities of dangers that have persisted throughout the one nuclear era that we are continuing to kind of exist within. Okay. I think we shouldn't romanticize the sort of stability of the nuclear past. I think the Cold War was actually extraordinarily dangerous in all sorts of ways, and the new nuclear age may continue those dangers, but it doesn't seem to me to be fundamentally more dangerous. And nor, I think there's a tendency when we talk about this kind of new nuclear age to kind of use that as the basis for thinking, well, we're kind of flying blind here. We don't have the kind of tools or the policies to understand the new nuclear age. And actually, I think that's not a helpful way of thinking about this, right? We actually have pretty good concepts, pretty good theories, pretty good policy tools that we've used to address nuclear dangers in the past. And we shouldn't automatically kind of assume that those tools no longer have validity or use in the new nuclear age. Right? And we also shouldn't overreact to challenges or dangers we face in ways that may generate self-fulfilling prophecies, right? As I mentioned, right, the concept of the new nuclear age is not a politically neutral one. It's used as the basis for a whole bunch of particular policy recommendations, right? And so I think we should actually, try to focus a little more on the specific sources of nuclear risk, right? And ways we might think about reducing them, rather than kind of these broad statements about the existence of a new nuclear age that I think ultimately are not entirely persuasive. Okay, so with that, I will thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to questions and conversations and criticisms, and